I think like these two papers go hand in hand, since the paper I read basically is a survey on, let's say, the current status of explainable NLP datasets. I thought about starting like this sort of review of this paper, just to throw it out there with a question, like, what is it? What is an explanation? In this case, I decided like to steal a quote from Dennis Hilton, where basically he says that an explanation, you can see it like a three-place predicate in which someone explains something to someone else. The thing is that, as you might see, this definition is quite like simple. The problem is that, okay, it's simple, not trivial. In fact, we can find explanations in different formats. Linguistic variety should also be taken into account. Quality of the explanation is not like a given. And this is, let's say, especially crucial when it comes to explaining the reasoning, or at least the predictions of NLP models. As a consequence, in this study, this research group, what they did was basically take into account roughly 60 datasets from multiple NLP tasks, like sentiment classification, question answering, or natural language inference, and basically try to understand and compile a list of which are the types of explanations that are currently available in the wild, and how were those explanations collected, not only from the perspective of the people, crowd workers who are engaged, or experts and so on, but also like the actual, let's say, format, let's say, design choices of the experiment, how actually those explanations have been collected. What they, let's say, found out is basically that you can sort of group these explanations under three major categories: highlights, free text, and structured explanations. Basically, highlights consists of explaining a model decision using subsets from the actual input of that model. Free text explanations, of course, I mean, I guess it's self-explanatory, meaning that the explanations are not like constrained to anything and neither to the input, to a particular input instance. And then structured explanations, in where they basically mix natural language with certain constraints, for example, like inference rules, or they use like, for example, template-like strategies. Just to give you like an example, in the first row of this table, we can see, for example, it is like a natural language inference. The task is NLI, and you can see, of course, premise, hypothesis, and then the assigned label. And in the form of a highlight, you basically like explain, for example, in this case, is labeled as a contradiction, and that contradiction is explained by, I don't know, track and yard, which don't go really, let's say, hand in hand together in this context. Free text, as I said, natural language, just to explain what the label is. And then in the second row, you can find an example of a structured explanation, which is a bit more, let's say, can involve also more formal languages. Now, let's see, analyzing each family of explanations by itself. Highlights, basically, the current status is that you can find them at different granularities, starting from single words up to group of words together, as long as, let's say, as per the definition, they are subsets of the input. let's say, desirable properties of these highlights should be like compactness, meaning that the highlights should be short and coherent with what let's say the task is and the prediction that was made. They should be sufficient, meaning that they should be really, let's say, maybe it's a mouthful, but should be really highlight of what is going on with the model and why it gave that particular decision. Then there's also like a third property, which is more or less not really, not particularly enforced, which is comprehensiveness, which means that a given highlight should like be self-contained and should provide all the evidence supporting that particular prediction from that from a given input instance. Problems. There are, of course, like some downsides to highlights as of now, is that many studies often build highlights by proposing results, let's see, from different tasks. For example, for the Stanford sentiment tree bank, basically what you have is that it's a data set containing crowd annotated phrases that are taken, that are extracted from movie reviews. What they do to produce their set of highlights is to basically say, check whether or not a review is positive or negative. If that particular phrase was labeled, let's say, for example, positively, then you sort of like heuristically merge those phrases, and then you get your highlight out of it. Problem being that these processes, how they like collect, especially highlights and so on, are often poorly reported, if reported at all. There's no, like, how to say, there's no clear method or justifications for their choices. And for the last, let's see, for the last property about comprehensiveness, they usually try to evaluate it post hoc, meaning that once you have their collection, they sort of like try and see comprehensiveness under the lenses of plausibility of the explanation and fidelity. So it's not like it's treated more like a byproduct. It's not really a, how to say, a requirement from the get-go. About free text explanations, on the other hand, they're often, let's say, regarded as a somewhat popular solution as of now, mainly because of their expressive power. Of course, you're not constrained to an input. There's no, let's say, structure imposed on you. And usually for these data sets, what's been found is that the free text explanations do not consist of no more than a few sentences, essentially. On the other end, similarly, in contrast and similarly to highlights, we have a problem of, okay, it's natural language. It often comes with, it often is underspecified. There are inconsistencies in the reports, low quality control from the from who should have run the experiments, and all this, let's say, all this led to basically an increasing interest toward what are called structured explanations. Basically, similarly, for example, with the question answering task that Jay was mentioning before, one example to provide structured explanation is to actually let force participants in actually creating this thought process and highlighting all the different reasoning steps that led them to a particular answer. Another example, just like I mentioned before, they use semi-structured text providing like templates or allowing for the use of for the reuse of only parts of the input, and then augmenting it via, let's say, via natural language means. There's also challenges with the structured explanations, meaning that they can, depending on, for example, on the type of template, how do you define it and how those templates are defined, essentially, you may end up with explanations that are uninformative. And if you, let's say, yeah, and if the plan is to like use those particular explanations, for example, to train a self-explaining model, that can like cause essentially problems down the line. On the collection method, let's say this wasn't the focus of this review of this survey paper. So they only like basically enumerate the most the techniques that are most often found. So involving crowd workers to provide explanations, automatic or semi-automatic methods like web scraping, database crawling, and so on. And finally, explanations in some instances are also provided by, let's say, individuals. So the authors themselves, experts or students. It's not all, let's say, bad, meaning that there's also some, let's see, the authors come forth with also some suggestions. And the first one regards like the lack of linguistic variety, because and this is both true. For example, when you have templates, so that you sort of like need to make sure that they don't turn out to be uninformative, but also some researchers noticed that basically by letting people create free text explanations from scratch, what happens is that, what they notice is that they tend to use somewhat of like a reduced vocabulary of words. So the suggestion is to actually, let's say, employ some sort of divide and conquer strategy, meaning that you, in the first step, you collect explanations via the methods that we just seen, for example, crowdsourcing and so on. And then you have a second pool, for example, of crowd workers that either judges the annotations. So basically you outsource the quality control of those explanations, or you outsource like the task of editing those particular explanations. In particular, in the second case, at least the authors argue that this should somewhat mitigate the effects of this reduced vocabulary when writing free text explanations. On the other side, they also, let's say, try to tackle the problem of diversity. And apart from the, let's call it the usual suspect of, okay, try to get a larger, more representative set of annotators for gathering these explanations, try to make a conscious effort in collecting multiple annotations per instance, and trying to measure, or at least evaluate the disagreement between the annotators, because funnily enough, they found out that many datasets actually just take for, let's say, for granted, take for good only one explanation per input per data instance. So there's also like that to keep in mind. And also, let's say, they advocate to embrace the idea of, okay, I can have multiple explanations for a particular instance. Annotators disagree. But let's say, worst case, you have to like maybe to engage an additional one and sort of like resolve a tiebreaker situation. Best case, you just discovered basically two different explanations that are both correct for that particular instance. Another thing that like they propose is maybe try to that they don't like put too much focus on this one, on this last one, is to find what they call the contrastive explanations, meaning that, oh, the model gave I don't know, prediction X, why is this instead of another? Like it should be Y, for example. So to sum everything up, and this is also like, I think it ties in with the, quite nicely also with the discussion that we were having, I think, last week, which are the, like the data set that we have versus the ones that we actually need. And basically, okay, the current landscape of explainable NLP datasets is, let's see, varies quite a lot, and there's like more and more like an increasing need for good and also open datasets for NLP. Open, not only that those data is actually, let's say, openly accessible, you can go and download it, but documented the, let's say, choices and constraint of those, that those choices may put on explanations should be like present and documented. Structure is not something that like people, or at least people, researchers that run the experiment should necessarily enforce on the participants that are providing the explanations, but should be like something that would emerge naturally. Linguistic roadblocks, meaning like low variety or diversity, can be overcome with let's say, principled involvement of the crowd, just like we've seen with the collect and edit or collect and judge methodology that they propose. And the nice thing is that still, this is, let's say, an active repository. You can go, you can search for this, you can look it up. I left the link here. There's still, should be still contributions to this data set, so it's like an ongoing work. And I think about, thought about like, since I opened this little talk with a question, and we've like quite quickly saw which are the data sets that are currently available for explanations right now, I would like to end with another question for you. And this is, now that we have seen what are the pros and cons, what makes a good explanation, and not just an explanation.